Wherever the cloud is, that's wherever the cloud's at, that's where I'm going to find this. So, all right, let's hide that. I don't want that. Okay, well, like I said, good morning, everybody. Um, as you can see, we're going to be kind of doing a follow-up to the last talk I gave about a month ago, which was on the coming of Elijah, where it's talked about in Malachi 4, but whether that's something that's already happened or if it's still future, and whether it's actually Elijah or whether the role of the second coming of Elijah was fulfilled by John. And that's kind of the conclusion we came to last time. And there's some questions on it because, I don't have time to talk about as many things as I want to. Um, and I did send out an email addressing one of the questions that I had, and I think others had too. And that had some good feedback. So we're going to cover that and just a number of the other things because, whenever you're looking at stuff like this, it's like it's not just looking at objections. We're going to be learning a lot of other things that are related to this too. Um, so if you missed the last one, I'll actually, whenever I have this done and recorded, I plan to send both of them out through the newsletter in both a Word document and also um, like a video. So if you want to watch or listen, but uh, anyways, there's a number of ways to go about this. Actually, of course. And I think the best way to go about it is to just kind of look at what Brother Thomas talks about it in Elpis Israel, because he makes a number of points, and there might be some other objections that aren't in that, but I think the majority of the ones that people think of, he mentions there. So I want to start out by just reading what he thought Elijah was supposed to do, his second coming, and why he thinks John the Baptist could not have been that. So this is in Elpis Israel. It says, it would seem from the testimony of Malachi, who prophesied concerning the 10 tribes, that while they are in the wilderness of the people, they will be disciplined by the law of Moses as their national code, while things concerning Jesus will be propounded to them as a matter of faith. So this is something that's still featured today. This is talking about the final regathering of the Jews dispersed throughout the earth. Um, and it says, for it is testified by Hosea, they shall be gathered and shall sorrow a little for the burden of the king of princes. The person with whom they will have more immediately to do in their second exodus is Elijah. There would seem to be a fitness in this. In the days of their fathers, or in the days of their fathers, when they forsook the Lord and abolished the law of Moses, Elijah was the person whose ministerial life was occupied in endeavoring to restore all things. Though he did much to vindicate the name and the law of Yahweh, he was taken away in the midst of his labors. For what purpose? That he might at a future period resume his work and perfect it by restoring all things among the 10 tribes according to the law of Moses, preparatory to their being planted in their land under a new covenant to be made with them there. So what he's saying here is basically Hosea talks about that they're going to sorrow a little for the burden of the kings and princes, and he interprets that to mean that the Jews, the lost 10 tribes specifically, that's the only class he's talking about here, is the lost tribes of Israel that went into Assyria and never came back. They're the ones that they're going to basically realize that it's Jesus they persecuted before they come into the land, and they're going to sorrow for that. We won't actually talk about this later, so I'll mention it now, but that verse in Hosea 8:10, if you look up different versions of it, there's about 12 different ways it reads, and some of it makes it seem like they're going to sorrow a little because of the kings and princes, which is talking about when they're in their lands of dispersion, kings and princes are going to cause them to sorrow. So it's not nearly as clear cut as it makes it seem there. Um, but basically, Elijah is going to be the one gathering them, and then Christ is going to meet them in Egypt and things like that. So we'll talk about that more later. And here it continues. He says, but it may be objected that Elijah has come already, and that John the Baptist was he. True, in a certain sense, he was. John was Elijah to the house of Judah, in the sense of his having come in the spirit and power of Elijah. But John was not the Elijah who talked with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. The latter the latter is Elijah to the house of Israel. The scribes taught that Elijah must precede Christ, which Jesus approved, saying, Elijah truly shall come first and restore all things. He said this after John was put to death. John did not restore all things, but Elijah will, and that too before the Lord Jesus makes himself known to the 10 tribes whom he will meet in Egypt. So, in that paragraph, that's what we're going to kind of dissect and like reasons why John is not Elijah. One, we can say, John said that he was not Elijah because the Jews asked him, "Are you Elias?" And he said, "No." Um, Number two, John was Elijah to the house of Judah, not Israel. And Brother Thomas's point there is the book of Malachi was written to Israel, and Israel was carried away and things like that. Um, and then in John's day, Israel was still technically carried away, so he couldn't have possibly have appeared to Israel. So it doesn't fit there. Number three, John only came in the spirit and power of Elijah, but it's not Elijah himself. And basically, this assumes that Malachi 4 requires that Elijah himself has to be there. Um, the fourth thing is, and there's a total of 7, so there's an end to this. Elijah appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, and that was not John because John was dead at this point. Elijah is supposed to restore all things, but this too was said after John had been killed, and therefore it must apply to Elijah's future coming. Um, as we saw earlier, Elijah is needed to lead this second Exodus. He's kind of to play the role of a second Moses, basically. And then lastly, as a result of that, Christ is going to meet these tribes in Egypt as a result of Elijah's work. So basically, all we're going to do is go through each of these and look at them and see what the impact they have on things and what's valid and what's not. And the first, and the one I think that comes to mind, and rightly so, is this first one is, well, it seems like John settles this question. Do you remember? This is when John first appeared, and he came looking just like Elijah did. He had the same garments. Remember, he was in his wilderness until the day of his showing unto Israel. So people didn't even know who he was until there's this random guy who shows up in the same exact place that Elijah was taken up, saying the things that Elijah was supposed to say. So here's what it says in the record of John: when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?" And he confessed and denied not, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Art thou Elias?" And he saith, "I am not." "Art thou that prophet?" And he answered, "No." So there are actually 3 questions here. I used to think there were 2. I would look at it as, okay, they're asking if he's Christ. He says no. And then seeing, are you Elias? Are you that prophet? I thought that was kind of the same way of, asking if he was Elijah, but it would be kind of redundant to do that. So before we talk about the Elias part, that's the most pertinent, of course. It's interesting. This last question, "Art thou that prophet?" What are they actually talking about here? Well, this is actually Jewish belief based off of what was told in the days of Moses, back in Deuteronomy 18. It says, "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee and of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken." So the Jews, we know this is, of course, talking about Christ, but the Jews didn't know Christ at the time, so they didn't know who this person was. They thought it could have been any of the Old Testament prophets. It's pretty a popular thought that this was referring to Jeremiah who would reappear, so they didn't know. So they're like, well, if you're not the Messiah and you're not Elijah, are you the prophet that we've been looking for? And he also said no. So John Gill has some interesting commentary on that, but that's their intent when they're asking that question here. But our focus, of course, relates to the Elijah aspect. Now, it has to be, I think, understood that like many of the Jews in Christ's day, Brother Thomas believed, and I guess a lot of others as well, that Elijah was taken into heaven itself. So we've talked about that a lot last time, and we won't go into depth now, but we saw you really can't deny it. There's a letter written from Elijah no less than 4 years, between 4 and 10 years after he was taken up, written to one of the kings of Judah, who didn't even come to rule until years after Elijah was taken away. So Elijah was not taken into God's dwelling place. And that's important because we have 2 options here, basically. If Elijah is in heaven, kind of like Christ is in heaven now, then he's got to have a second coming. I mean, for what other purpose does God have him up there? And the reason Christ is on God's right hand is because he's sending him back one day and with a very specific list of things to do. So the question is, if Elijah's in heaven, then we have to basically like what verses are telling us what he's doing. We have to look and try to find some kind of evidence for his second coming and what he's going to do. And then the other side is if he's not in heaven, then we don't have to try to find evidence that shows what he's doing at his second coming. So this concept in and of itself makes or breaks how we look at these verses and what we're looking for. And I'll say the verses that have been supplied, and we won't talk about nearly all of them here, but supplied to show his second coming, I don't find a single one of them even remotely relate to Elijah's second role. But anyways, let's look at this here. I think the most important thing and the kind of the key to all of this is to understand the nature of the Jews' question. This is the core of the difficulty, and it's the key to its solution, because we have to remember what they expected of him. Last time I had this big long, I think it was like 2 slides that John Gill, I think it was, that explained this is the stuff that they believed concerning Elijah. And just a couple things. I mean, there's a whole list of things that have nothing to do with what Malachi 4 says Elijah's supposed to do. But the Jews just kind of conjured up their own beliefs and said, well, Elijah himself's going to appear, and he's actually going to choose the Messiah, in the sense that the Messiah won't even know who he is until Elijah tells him, hey, you're the Messiah. Obviously, there's not a single verse that supports that. They also show that he's going to have equal authority as the Messiah himself and do a lot of the same things that he's going to do. Remember, we talked about how even at Passover, they leave a seat open for Elijah just in case he returns and participates with them. And a lot of them even believe that he's got actually 3 comings and not 2. Again, not a lick of evidence for that at all, but that's what they believed, and that's what the Jews at the time of John believed. So their question is arising from their understanding. And that's an important thing because it's a corrupt understanding. But they would be pretty disappointed with what John was going to do because it wasn't going to be anything what they expect. Just like how Christ was nothing that they were expecting of the Messiah because they had false expectations of him as well. And again, it's got to be remembered that he was out of view of Israel and people until God told him, now you start preaching. So for all they knew, Elijah could have come back because we saw he's appearing in the same place that Elijah was taken up. Elijah could have descended down from heaven. They didn't see it. He just this random guy in the middle of the wilderness calling for people to repent. So therefore, they approach him. He's got camel's hair. He's got a leather girdle just like Elijah. And they ask him, are you Elijah? Because all appearances, they don't really know exactly what Elijah looked like because they didn't have photographs. They have a description. So by all appearances, this has got to be him. They're not asking, are you the coming or the Elijah that we're supposed to look for? They're asking, are you Elijah the Tishbite? Because that's what they expected. Now, again, they were going to be very disappointed here. But when John says, no, I'm not Elijah, it's the only correct answer there is because that's the question they're asking. He's not the individual. But like Christ says, it's I don't think I have it on here. It's Matthew 11:15 or 14. Christ says, this is, speaking of John, this is Elijah which was for to come, which means John the Baptist is the Elijah that Malachi said is going to come. So if John is not that person, I don't know how Christ could have said that actually. But the easiest way to see this is applying the same concept to another prophecy that's very similar, just with the way things are talked about. So, for example, in Malachi 4, we have a prophecy that says Elijah's going to come again. We believe that John was this Elijah, even though John's name is not Elijah. Like if you're just reading the prophecy of Malachi 4, there's nothing that indicates that this would not be Elijah himself. It just says Elijah. And therefore, when we come to the time of the prophecy's fulfillment with John, we find Jews are asking, they're ignorant of John's identity. That's why they're asking. But they recognize this is what Elijah's going to do. So are you him? Well, we see the same thing, or we can apply the same thing with Ezekiel 37. The verses in question are 23 through 25. Um, Actually, let's look that up real quick because otherwise it just might go right over our heads. Ezekiel 37:23 to 25. And this is the right after the Valley of the Dry Bones. If I can get there. 37:23 to 25. It says, neither shall they, talking about Israel, defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions. But I will save them out of the land of the dwelling places wherein they've sinned, and will cleanse them. And so shall they be my people, and I will be their God. And David my servant shall be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. They shall dwell in their land, and so on. Um, and then at the end of verse 25, it says, and my servant David shall be their prince forever. So it's a very similar thing. It doesn't say, there's no indication that this isn't actually David. It just says David. So we can take this prophecy and just kind of put it in the same sort of format. So let's fast forward to the future. And this is the time when David, my servant, is reigning over Israel. So Christ is sitting on his throne. Now let's just imagine a group of Jews. They're ignorant of Jesus' identity, just like they were ignorant of John, but they're very familiar with this prophecy. So they know this is what's going to happen. Um, and they therefore expect David himself to be ruling over Israel and doing these things. So that's what it says in black and white. And therefore, they see this man, glorified man on the throne, doing exactly what Ezekiel says David is going to do. And so they approach him and they say, "Are you David?" Well, that's exactly what they're doing with John. How would Christ respond? I mean, he's not going to say yes because they're expecting David, the son of Jesse. Um, the only correct answer would be, no, I'm not David. And of course, he could expound on that and say, well, I'm the seed of David. I'm David as in the beloved of the Lord and, the first one to rule in Jerusalem and all those other things. But um, it's in that way, I think it really helped me see this is the only way that all the stuff I find makes sense. Um, but the big question is, why would John not explain this more thoroughly to them? And actually, I ask myself this a lot with things that Christ said with the Jews. I mean, he gives them the answers that they're asking for, but he doesn't expound on it like I do and talk about it for an hour, um, he's given them as much as they're asking for, and they need to ask for more, but they don't. But we can talk about this a little bit and why he might not have. One thing to consider is that during this time, I mean, the Romans were ruling over Israel at the time, um, and it was pretty rough. I mean, a lot of even the religious parts of the nation, they were requiring a lot of money from people. The Romans were taxing heavily and so on. So people were looking for a Messiah. They were looking for Elijah, and you have a lot of imposters that arose. And if you read in Josephus, you see there's a lot of people who came and said, "I'm Elijah," and then they do this and that. And same thing, they say that they're the Messiah, and some of them actually make it remarkably far as deceiving people goes. But the way it ends every single time is they either are killed or they admit their falsehood. So for John to come out and just say, I'm the Elijah that's supposed to come and start doing all these things like everybody else is doing, it's going to throw him exactly in the category with everybody else. Um, so instead of telling Israel that he's the Elijah to come, what he was going to do is he was going to show them through his coming and his deeds. Because we know actions are they speak much louder than words do. And it's a general rule of truth, I think, that what we do tells people more about us than what we say we are. And it's actually, as it says, as Matthew 7:15 and 16 here, it's kind of this exhortation of beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. So it's what you do that shows who you are. Um, but adding to this, I think there's even more to this I found very interesting. That the testimony of others concerning us is more effective than what we claim ourselves to be. In Proverbs it talks about, let another man praise thee and not thine own mouth, because it's unseemly for you to do it for yourself. But it also means more coming when other people are talking about you. So Christ's testimony of John that this is the Elijah that should come, Christ's testimony would mean more than I think John's his own self. But I think this actually gets into something even more interesting and kind of how Christ interacted with his role as the Messiah. Because Christ came in the same way. He was not telling everybody, I'm the Messiah. I mean, they were asking him all the time, but he would perform a miracle and he'd do something, he'd teach. And then they say, are you the Messiah? And usually it was crickets, or on numerous occasions when he would heal a single person, he'd tell them, tell no man that I'm the Messiah. Um, but most, I think, noteworthy of this is what we find in Matthew 11, because this is when John is in prison, and I think John expected the kingdom to come right then and there, like a lot of the other disciples did. So John's in prison, and he sends his disciples to ask Christ, says, ask him, are you the Messiah, or are we looking for another one? Um, and we don't see Christ just saying, tell John, yes, I'm the Messiah, not to worry. He doesn't say that at all. Look at this. He says, now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent two of his disciples and said unto him, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Jesus answered and said unto them, go and show John again those things which ye do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And basically, what he's doing, he says, I'm doing all of these things right now. Tell John what I'm doing. And these are all things that are in the Old Testament prophecies, and said the Messiah is going to do all this stuff. So he says, go tell John that's what I'm doing, and that's going to give him his answer. Um, and it's the same thing with John. John is doing all the things that Malachi said he would. And that, I mean, to discerning Jews who really knew the law and what the law said and not what they think it said, I think they would know. So that's, I mean, I can kind of rush through that, I guess, but that's one of the bigger ones. This one's actually remarkably simple, and I don't know how the objection even came up really, but basically, like I said, this argument says that, Elijah was sent to Israel because the first time he came, he was in Israel. Malachi, the book, which talks about his second coming, is written primarily to Israel. Um, but Israel was carried away in 700 BC around there, by Assyria. John the Baptist, I'm sorry, no, John the Baptist came on the scene 700 years after Israel was gone. So all that's left is technically Judah. So therefore, John was only sent to Judah. Now, there's a number of things. Actually, I had a lot written on this, but I thought there's one thing that solves it so quickly that it's not even worth mentioning the other things. Um, it's called Israel in John's time. Like, it's not even a question. Just one example. Joseph and Mary, they fled into Egypt because remember Herod was trying to kill the young Messiah. And and they, it says, arise and take the young child and his mother and go into the land of Israel. So he says, Herod's dead, come back to the land, go into the land of Israel. And they arose and they took the young child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. So, and you can see all those verses listed there. There's dozens and dozens of others, but that just shows it's not just one person that calls the nation at the time Israel. That's the primary way, and it was referred to. Um, so I don't really. You can try to understand why, because we'll talk about that a little bit. I have a theory as why it was not incorrect to call it Israel at the time, but we'll talk about that later. But to make this even more clear, not only was it called Israel at the time, but John was to be sent specifically to Israel. And this is the angel Gabriel's testimony. It says, talking about John and when he's going to be born, it says, he, John, shall be great in the sight of the Lord and shall neither drink wine or strong drink, and so on. And many of the children of Israel shall he, John, turn to the Lord their God. And he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah. And this is the thing that Elijah is supposed to do in Malachi 4, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And he grew and waxed strong in spirit and was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel. So if they were only strictly calling it Judah, that would be something, but they call it Israel all the time. Um, and even more so, John's own testimony, talking about the Messiah and him coming. He says that even I, John, knew not the Messiah, but that he should be made manifest to Israel. Therefore, I'm come baptizing with water. So John's saying the reason I'm coming is to manifest the Messiah to Israel. Um, so, like I said, I found that one Um, Fairly easy there. But this third one here, kind of interesting. This one shouldn't take long either, just because it kind of relates to something we already talked about. But that basically the fact that John is said to have only come in the spirit and power of Elijah, but wasn't Elijah himself. That kind of hinges on the first objection where he says, "I'm not Elijah," and doesn't require that Elijah himself comes, but just wanted to kind of take that symbolic name. But there's something else worth mentioning here. Uh, like I said, I think it's without question that the way John appeared, I mean, from his before he was even born, his whole life was planned out. What he was going to do, what he was going to eat, what he was going to say. He appeared to give the impression that he was Elijah. Like I don't know for what other purpose he would have to do all these other things other than to give people the impression this is Elijah's second coming here. Um, but why did it have to be John, I guess, and not Elijah himself? Well, my answer to that would be that, it's because of the law of death that rules over man. I mean, God works in ways we can understand. He works within the parameters of his own laws that he's set. And as it says, it's appointed unto men once to die. Um, Elijah had to die at some point. He couldn't have lived the whole time from, basically 700 years or longer, actually, I guess. So it really wasn't possible for him to live in Christ's day. So God basically designed events to make it look as if he had. And that's why Elijah was taken away in the way he did, to give the impression that he was reserved by God. Not that he actually was, but it's all about giving the impression of it. But part of this, too, is this concept of manifestation. And I think this is another way we can see him being the Elijah here. Because when we think about Christ, I don't think anybody would disagree if we said that he came in the spirit and power of God, but he wasn't God himself. He couldn't be God himself for obvious reasons. So therefore, he came in the spirit and power of God. That's why his name, as it says in Matthew 1, his name would be Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. Um, so everything Christ said and did is exactly what God would do. That's why we can say he's God manifest in the flesh. We can say the same thing with John, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah, was raised to do everything he did. So I don't think it's incorrect to say that he's intended to be at least Elijah manifested again in the flesh. Um, Now, this one I find very interesting. Talking about, like Brother Thomas said, well, the disciples saw Elijah and Moses in the transfiguration. John was dead at this time, so that had to be Elijah himself. Now, we talked about this a little bit last time, but in that how the whole transfiguration was a vision, but we need to talk about it a little bit more here. Um, but again, if he believes Elijah's in heaven, then that's what modern Christian believes. They look at this like, well, of course these people are here. They're already glorified, right? As we speak right now, it's nothing for them to appear on the mountain with Jesus here. But there's two ways we know this is a vision. The first is that Christ said it was a vision, and it's in Matthew 17:9. This is the next thing he says to them when he comes down. He says, "Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen again from the dead." Now, this word vision, there's a couple different words used to just to translate into the English vision, but the word here is this Greek haroma, and every appearance of it you can see listed there. I mean, that's every place it shows up in the Bible, and in every instance, it refers to a divine revelation, like a vision in the sense of God's showing somebody something that they wouldn't see naturally. Just for instance, one of these, I know it's in Acts, when Peter saw this sheet knit of clean and unclean animals come down from heaven, I think it was three times. God told him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." It didn't actually happen. This is something you kind of call it a trance or something like that. But that's the same word used to describe this here that Christ says, when you saw Elijah and John, this is a vision. Um, but the other reason is basically it's why they had to wait. He's like, wait until I'm raised from the dead to tell anybody about this. And it's like, well, what's the purpose of that? Who cares? Why would you want to wait? But it gets directly down to first principles, because not only does Christ appear in a glorified state, but we see Elijah and Moses are glorified here too. I mean, there's not even a question. In Luke 9, it says Moses and Elijah who appeared in glory. So this is a vision actually of the kingdom, and Christ tells us this too. Um, but like I said, for instance, for those who believe in heaven going right after death, there's no problem for Moses and Elijah to be in glory here before Christ has even died. They're already glorified here. How is that even possible? Um, and it's not possible. That's the fact of the matter, because nobody can be glorified before Christ is. The scriptures teach that all men return to dust, and they must await the return of Jesus, who was, in order for them to be resurrected, then judged, and then, if found acceptable by Christ, then they're glorified. So at this point, Christ has not even died yet. So, and as we know too, in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about him being the first fruits of them that slept. So it literally means he's the first one to attain eternal life. But if this whole thing's just a vision of the coming age, it makes perfect sense. Um, but so basically, they had to wait because until Christ himself had been raised, all this was basically a promise. Just like all the other promises of inheriting the land, it wasn't legally possible or legally sealed until the blood of the everlasting covenant had been shed, which is Christ's blood. Um, so we can see here in First Timothy or Second Timothy 4, nobody's glorified till he comes, because when he shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing and in his kingdom. But I think the most important part of all this is, there's three different gospel accounts of the transfiguration. For some reason, Matthew, they divide the chapters up weird. I think in Mark and Luke, you can see this more easily just because of the chapter divisions. But before every single account of the transfiguration, it is immediately preceded by Christ telling his disciples, "There be some standing here which shall not taste of death till the Son of Man be risen from the dead." Now, uh, the taste of death means to experience it at all. I mean, in Hebrews 2, it talks about Christ that, he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. So for them to not even taste it means they don't die yet. Like in that current temporal life, they were going to see Christ coming in his kingdom. And then they have the transfiguration. So that's just the transfiguration's the fulfillment of that little prophecy there. So basically, the whole thing's a vision. Elijah and Moses himself don't have to be there literally. Um, this is another interesting one, talking about how John did not restore all things like Malachi said he would. Um, I think this is, I guess, probably the second strongest point I see, because this is also something that takes place right after the transfiguration account, because the disciples, having seen Moses and Elijah, they asked Jesus, why say then that the Elijah, or why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come? So then Christ affirms this, and he says, Elijah truly shall come first and restore all things. Now, we talked about last time how he's simply showing approval of their understanding of chronology. Like, well, yeah, Elijah's got to come first and then the Messiah. Um, but he follows this and says, but, a big but. So that's right, except there's a place they went wrong, and says that Elijah is come already, and they knew him not. And then it says that the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. Now, that's the only understanding I have that answers all the questions here, but um, let's for a moment just assume John did not restore all these things, because what does it really mean to restore all things? Because it's on that phrase right there that all of this is kind of hinged. Because if John did restore all things, then there's no need for anybody else to do it. Um, the more we learn, the more we realize that all very rarely means all. Like it's usually all of a subcategory of a group or something like that. Um, and it talks. And this is another example of that. I think it's also important that when it says, "Well, John didn't restore all things," those things really aren't outlined that he didn't do. Like, well, what was he supposed to do that he didn't? But I think we can clearly say that this can't mean all things literally, because it's Christ who's the one who's supposed to restore all things. All these verses you see here talk about Christ is the one who's going to enact the restitution of all things, which is, not just the removal of the curse, but unity with God and man. And I mean, it literally refers to all things there that Christ is doing. So Elijah can't do that because that role is taken. So whatever he's doing, it's got to be a lesser all than that. Um, but I think we can say that I think this restoration applied to Elijah relates to restoring Israel to a right mind and expectation, like Malachi 4 says. There's two commentators on this that I think they have really astute views on this. So it's Albert Barnes and John Gill. So let's read those real quick. So this is Albert Barnes. So this is on the phrase Elias truly shall come and restore all things. He says that he did not mean by this that Elijah was yet to come, for he tells them immediately that he had come. But he meant to affirm that it was a true doctrine which the scribes taught, that Elijah would appear before the coming of the Messiah. To restore means to put into former situation. See Matthew 12:13. Hence it means to heal, to correct, to put in proper order. Here it means that Elijah would put things in a proper state. He would be the instrument of reforming the people or of restoring them in some measure to proper notions about the Messiah and preparing them for his coming. Before the coming of John, their views were erroneous, their expectations were worldly, and their conduct were exceedingly depraved. He corrected many of their notions about the Messiah. You can see that in Matthew 3. And he was the instrument of an extensive reformation and thus restored them in some degree to correct views of their own system and of the Messiah to a preparation for his advent. So there, I think he does a good job explaining that. And John Gill has another view on it. Basically the same, just explains it in a little different way. Um, some of these other versions of the scriptures, of the Syriac and the Persic versions, read instead of restore, it says, he shall perfect or complete all things that are prophesied of him, and shall put a period to the law and prophets, and close the Mosaic economy, and direct persons to Christ, in whom are the perfection of the law and the fulfilling of the prophets. The Arabic version reads, he shall teach you all things, the whole of the gospel being reduced to these two heads, repentance toward God and faith in Christ. Those are the two things that John was preaching. Um, well, and it says, both of which were taught by the true Elijah. But the truest sense of the phrase is to be learned out of Malachi 4:6. So this is going back to the prophecy about him. He shall restore, he shall turn all things, the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers. And this is explained in Luke 1 about John, that he's, basically, we already read that, but he's just saying this is a different and better work than what the Jews assigned to him. So, what John actually did is way better than the false things that the Jews made up about him. But in short, this term to restore all things refers to Israel and the prophecy John's going to fulfill. So I think we can just look back at Luke 1:17 and this is what Elijah was going to do. Here's the verses that say John's doing it. I think it's that simple myself. But there's actually, and if you look at the word to turn, this is in the New Testament, of course, about John. This is Strong's, I don't remember how to say the word, but the word turn means to revert, literally, figuratively, or morally, or to restore. So we can replace this word turn in Luke here and say, John's going to go forth in the spirit and power of Elijah to restore the hearts of the fathers. So, I mean, it matches very well when you actually look at what these original words actually mean. Now, but that aspect of timing is kind of important here too, because like a lot of these things were said after John was dead. Um, so, and I think it's supported by the fact that it's the future tense. Like, why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come? Like, that's something that has to happen in the future, supposedly. But if we look at how the question is asked, I think the difficulty disappears. So, they say, why must he first come? And Christ answers, Elijah truly shall first come. So that's also future tense, and restore all things. But then he says, I say unto you, Elijah's come already. So since the scribes believed that he hadn't come yet, of course, the scribes are going to ask, this is in the future tense. They didn't think John was him. So Elijah's got to come before the Messiah does. And that's one reason why they didn't think Jesus was the Messiah, because they're looking for Elijah the Tishbite, who was not showing up. Um, but I think the essence of the Christ answer is this, um, like the scriptures do say that Elijah must, or he shall come first, but then he says, like, that's a right concept, but here's where you went wrong. He's already here, and you didn't know who he was. And I think the easiest way to see this is to also take the same thing and put it in a different situation. Um, concerning Revelation 16, it talks about the Euphratean power is going to dry up, and then these frog-like spirits are going to go forth and deceive the nations. So basically, some people believe that hasn't happened yet. That refers to the Ottoman power, which has been gone for over 100 years now. But some people believe it hasn't happened yet. So people could ask me, so why do some say that the Euphratean power must first be dried up before the frog-like spirits go forth? And what I would say is, well, the Euphratean power truly shall dry up first because that's what the scriptures say. But I'm telling you that it's already happened. So in that sense, you can kind of see how these tenses make sense here. Um, and they didn't believe John was this Elijah, and as a result, I don't know if I don't have it on here, but as because they didn't recognize him, Christ says they have done unto him whatsoever they listed. So he was beheaded and killed, and then he says right after that, in the same exact way, they didn't recognize Christ, and he therefore says that likewise also shall the Son of Man suffer them. So he's prophesying they're not going to know me either. If they know the Elijah's come, they're not going to know the Messiah's come either, and how true that turned out to be. Um, so it's interesting to see how all these things are related and explains why just one of the many reasons why they didn't believe Jesus was him, the Messiah at least. So number 6 here, I'm just kind of get going here. This concept of Elijah being necessary to lead a second Exodus. Um, and Elijah or John Thomas mentioned that verse about there's a verse in Hosea. I think it says, I think it's Hosea 1:11. It's in chapter 1. It says that they're going to appoint themselves ahead and come up out of the land. Um, but there's actually some interesting things on this, and this would be a subject for, oops, um, subject for another talk. But the entire concept of the lost tribes of Israel is actually kind of debatable, and we'll talk a little bit about it here. But basically, there's history and verses which show that before Assyria came down to carry away Israel, there was a huge remnant out of Israel that fled and came down into Judah and in Jerusalem. So there's verses which talk about this in like Micah 2:12. We won't look at it, for example, but there's also historical things that show that during this time, right before Assyria came down, the walls, there's all these temporary walls of Jerusalem that were built really quick, way bigger than the other ones because there's just so many people that are coming down now and seeking refuge. But that prophecy in Micah 2, I think it talks about them coming down and Jerusalem and Judah swelling because of this kind of thing. Like I said, it'd be a subject for a different time, but to make matters more difficult, I think, though, basically, let me sum that up first. So the concept is, it seems like God had told the faithful in Israel, I'm bringing Assyria down. Anybody who's faithful to me, you need to come down into Judah, and that remnant that came out from that point forward, they would be Israel. Like the other ones, they're just going to be cast off. They're fully cast off. The new Israel, or the remainder of Israel, is now kind of absorbed in Judah. And I think that's one reason why, when we come to the time of Christ, they're calling it Israel, because it's not necessarily incorrect to call them both, because you got people of both nations in the land there. But to make matters more difficult, 200 years after Assyria came down, Judah itself was also carried away into Babylon. And then they came back from Babylon. Some stayed in Babylon. But in Christ's day, we have some people who are in the land, and then we've got some Jews in Babylon, and we got some Israelites in Assyria still. So they're still kind of all over the place that they need to be gathered. And it seems that there's a lot of thoughts on this, and I'm not convinced of one yet, but James, in the very first verse of his book, he says he was writing to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Um, it seems interesting that he would write to all the dispersed Jews. That seems to be what he's saying here. Um, but I'm suggesting as a possibility that he's referring to all these 12 tribes, meaning that 10 of them, they're not gone forever. They're still out there. They're just in their foreign lands. Um, but all of this, like I say, is negligible basically because even in the people in the land in Christ's day, the Romans scattered them to the four corners of the earth. So basically, wherever you want to look at it, the people who have to be gathered now, they're of Judah and they're of Israel. So Brother Thomas is saying they're only Elijah's only appearing to the 10 tribes of Israel. Well, so does that mean he's just going to ignore all those of Judah? I mean, there's a mixed multitude that has to be brought back either way. I don't see how you can filter it down where he's ignoring the Jews and bringing back the Israelites. Um, but then there's some logistical issues of, you know, all of them coming up through Egypt. Because like with Moses, we know that with all of Israel was in Egypt. Like with Christ, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the regathering that's needed now, it's from everywhere. I mean, there's verses here you can see that I'm bringing the seed from the east, from the west, the north and south, from the ends of the earth. Isaiah 11 talks about even mentioning a lot of these specific lands, and this is important too. The Lord shall set his hand again the second time. So this is like the second Exodus to recover the remnant of his people from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and the islands of the sea. And this is the important part. Um, in the end of 12, he shall set an ensign for the nations and assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah. Because I may have skipped it over in my notes here, but there's one thought that basically any Jews who are in Israel today, they would be considered Judah, and anybody who needs to be gathered still is considered Israel. So regardless of who they actually are, or what their lineage is, anyone in Israel is Judah, prophetically named, and anyone outside is Israel. But that's a problem here because it shows that both of them need to be gathered here in Isaiah 11. So hopefully that makes sense. But the other thing here is just the methods of how they're going to be gathered, because it's not like in Exodus where you have Moses who's leading them out. They're coming from all different points of the earth, and the prophecies which show them coming back seems to indicate that Christ is calling them back as compared to leading them individually like Moses did. Zechariah 10:1, where it says, I will hiss for them and gather them, for I have redeemed them, and they shall increase as they've increased. I will sow them among the people, and they shall remember me in far countries, and they shall live with their children and turn again. And I will bring them again also out of the land of Egypt, and gather them out of Assyria. So Egypt's part of this, of course, but that's not the only place. This word hiss, it means it's a shrill or a whistle, so it's like literally a whistle to get people's attention and have them come back. Um, Isaiah 5 also expounds on this, talking about this ensign set up for the nations from afar. He will hiss from the ends of the earth, and behold, they shall come with speed swiftly. So he's not pulling them in the sense of going to that place, gathering them, and walking them back. They're coming with speed swiftly. And none, just like in the days of the Exodus, none shall be weary nor stumble among them. None shall slumber nor sleep. Neither shall the girdle of their loins be loosed, nor the latch of their shoes be broken. And you remember they walked, I think, for 3 days and nights straight out of Egypt to get to the Red Sea. And these same things are said where their clothes, nothing was wearing down. There's also verses which talk about their journey being made very easy, which I think explains the swiftness with which they're coming. Like it actually talks about him parting the Red Sea again for him and all these other rivers they come to. But Christ sitting on his or his eternal throne, he doesn't have to be there to do that. This last one, I know I'm over, so I'll kind of rush through this, but um, this is Christ meeting them in Egypt. So this is assuming the one we last talked about is true. And I think it's untenable that all of Israel, all the dispersed are going to be brought to Egypt. Christ is going to meet them, then they come into the land. Um, but so there's basically two verses which are used to support this. One's Hosea 11, which says, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt." This is one verse I think Brother Thomas cites to show they're going to come out of Egypt again, which is true. It's just not just Egypt. But as far as the scriptures go, it shows two applications of this. And the first one's very clear if you just read the chapter, and it's talking about God being the father of the nation of Israel because He brought them out of Egypt when they were a child or a young nation. I mean, before the Exodus, there was no nation of Israel. Like it was the people because they were just basically tribes. But when they came out of Egypt, this is when the nation of Israel was born. They received a law and a national identity at Sinai because of God. So that's what I think the primary thing is the prophets reminding the people in Hosea, God created this nation, and therefore He's emphasizing their responsibility to Him. The other aspect is actually specifically called out, and it refers to Christ. And again, this goes back to when Joseph and Mary had to go down into Egypt to flee Herod. And it says that God called them out of Egypt, said, "Come into the land. The man that seeks the child's life is dead." And this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." So, it makes sense with Israel coming out of Egypt because all of them were in Egypt at the time. Christ, he was only central in Egypt. He came out. But then you have the scattered Jews. It doesn't make sense if you're applying it that because they're coming from all the countries through which he's driven them. But and I think that explains why Christ is summoning them instead of leading them. So where it does say in Ezekiel, but this is the other verse. It's Ezekiel 20. We won't read all of it basically, but it says, "I'll bring you into the wilderness of the people, and there will I plead with you face to face. Like as I pleaded with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so I'll plead with you." And, this verse is looked at and says, well, see, it says just like he did with Egypt, which means this is going to take place in Egypt again. Well, it's not what it says. It says it's going to take place in the wilderness of the people, but it's going to be like it happened with in Egypt. So it's the same action. It's a different location. This wilderness of the people refers to the nations that they've been scattered through. And basically, these verses just show how Israel was kind of prophetically spoken of as their home. Any nations outside of that were called wilderness, and the people persecuting them were called these beasts and things like that. Like Deuteronomy 28 says, you're going to be removed into all kingdoms of the earth. Your carcass is going to be meat to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the earth and things like that. So, but basically, it seems that there's a couple of views on how that actually be carried out. And my thinking personally is there's no question that these verses talk about a kind of sifting of the remaining Jews before they come into the land. And it seems most likely to me is since this is going to take place in their lands that they've been distributed from, this might be something that the saints take part in, and Elijah could be part of that, of course. But we believe that in order for Christ to rule the entire earth, he'll kind of distribute it evenly with saints as governors and princes and things like that. And that could be, and this is just a suggestion, but it could be a role of the saints at the time. So there's other things we could talk about, like a highway that's going to go from Egypt to Assyria, which just shows that they can't all come from Egypt. It just doesn't make sense. But I think the concept of Elijah being in heaven kind of forced an interpretation of these things a certain way because, well, what else is otherwise? We don't know what Elijah's supposed to do. But my thought is, not that he doesn't have to do anything, but he doesn't have a second coming like has been thought. But so basically, that's my thoughts. I got some others I could share, but we're well over time. Hope it was at least interesting, and there's some other things that you always learn when you're looking at something. But as it says, kind of with Christ and the Transfiguration, that the reason they could appear in glory, or they could tell others about them appearing in glory after Christ was raised, is because it's on that basis that all men have hope. If only we participate in God's plan and faithfully walk with our God in it.